Hi, I'm Thomas. Thanks for having me. I want to talk about a notion that I still don't know exactly how to describe, but I think of it as conceptual complexity, which is essentially a way of determining the criteria for when a particular user is going to be an apt user for a particular concept. And the background of this is sort of when I was working at Psych, when I was working on Psych, we'd have a whole litany of explanations or justifications generated for things, all of which were valid, but not necessarily all of them were quality justifications, despite their validity. And so the quality of proofs isn't the entire story. However, when you have a number of different users, the quality of a proof or a justification is subjective. It's determined by the user. So trying to line up properties of the user that you get from a user profile with particular justifications is, I think, an interesting problem. So the first thing I'm going to do is describe sort of the general shape of what I mean by conceptual complexity. And then I want to talk about a way of trying to mine texts to get to populate these conceptual complexities. First thing to mention, right, is, if we're thinking about conversational agents or chatbots or something like this, explanations that one might give to a user are not given in isolation, right? The utility is determined by the properties of that particular user, and it's only going to be useful if the user is actually capable of making use of that explanation, namely to understand it. So a conversational agent, however, can be tasked with supporting a wide range of users. And we've got a little Alexa device, right, in my house. My 10-year-old might use it. I might use it. My parents might come to visit and they might use it. And all of us have different, profiles. All of us have different capabilities, commands of various components of language, proficiencies. And so having some way of determining that is important. So one of the very sort of simple theses that I want to get across is just this: an explanation should be presented to an agent just in case that agent can be reasonably expected to grasp the concepts that are in use in that explanation. I think there's almost almost a truism. It's so obvious. To illustrate what I mean by this, we might think about somebody asking a conversational agent for a question: why does an Arctic fox have a white coat in the winter? And we can distinguish different types of proofs that we might get or justifications. We can think of a relatively Baroque, kind of Rococo one, that gets mechanistic, right? In winter months, there's less UV light. Biologically, less UV radiation reduces production of alpha melanocyte stimulating hormones, and there's these mechanistic things that go on biologically that lead to a white coat. Alternately, we can have a very pithy one, which is just white fur allows an Arctic fox to blend in with its surroundings during the winter. And both of these, I think, are valid, equally good justifications, but they're certainly, right, very distinct in their characters. And we can distinguish them along a number of different axes, right? In the first case, right, the Baroque proof has more steps. It's more complex in its flow than the other one. It's more, second one is very pithy and direct. The mode of explanation is different, right? The first one appeals to these sort of biochemical properties. The latter is sort of, more geared towards the general audience. And the important thing here, though, is that I think the concepts that are in use in the first one are unlikely to be grasped by a general audience. If you provided this top proof to my 10-year-old, if you provided this to me and I have a PhD, I would still look at you with a dead stare, because I don't know what many of these terms mean. So just to approach something kind of formal, I want to define something like conceptual complexity of a semantic item. So if we're talking about like a description logic, the concepts, the relations, is some kind of formal representation of the conditions that we expect of a user so that we can deploy that concept to that user. So to illustrate, how this might be implemented, one sort of naive approach would be to give a sort of numeric complexity, right? We can think of, age as being a pretty good proxy, perhaps, for when an individual is capable of understanding concepts. So, something like dog or canine, this is something that I could walk into a kindergarten and talk about dogs, and all the little kids' eyes would light up in recognition. But when I move to something more abstract like democracy, that would fall on deaf ears in the kindergarten, perhaps. But if I went to 10-year-olds, they'd start to understand it. If I wanted to speak about cosines, maybe high school age children, teenagers, they'd understand it. So, age is sort of, a way of determining when a user can understand something. And we can extend this from concepts to explanations or justifications, right? So for a justification, we could just take the maximum of all the complexities for terms that appear in that explanation. So this is, of course, a very naive. One thing that we can observe is that as we become more educated, right, training becomes sort of hyper specialized. So there's no real sufficient age that we can reliably count on to assume that an individual understand what lymphangiectasia is, which is some kind of pulmonary disorder. Again, I'm not familiar with. So in order to address this, we might think about assigning these complexities against the background ontology of proficiencies or professions or specializations. And if this is the case, right, then we could define conceptual complexity against classes of agents. So just to repeat the examples, right, the complexity of dog would just be all agents. Something abstract like democracy, we could say, well, if you've gone through elementary school, you probably grasp this concept. Cosine, folks in high school. And this gives us the flexibility then to say, well, look, I know what the complexity of lymphangiectasia is. It's, people that have a pulmonology specialty, they can reliably understand it. So if I want to deploy an explanation that makes use of this, I need to look at my user's profile. I need to look at their specialties, and this is safe in this case. And we can extend this to explanations in toto by saying, these are all classes, by taking the intersection of all of the complexities that appear in that explanation. So having something like this is useful for a number of reasons. We can, if we have like thinking about psych would just, give you 12 different explanations or something without any understanding of which ones are most appropriate. But this could, something like this helps to determine what is the best explanation to deliver to a user given that user's profile. If we don't have a unique best one, or we don't have one that may be fitting, it might point us into the direction of repairing the explanation. We can look for co-extensive terms and look at some substitutions that might make it more manageable for an agent. Or it can provide us with a guide to give additional contextual cues. So perhaps something that the agent may not understand, but we can make sure that we put in an addendum on there, some kind of explanatory note. Hey, this is what this means in terms that you'd understand. So having something like this can help in a number of different ways. Okay, so given the desire to have some kind of measure of the complexity of a concept and the complexity of an explanation in this sense, there's a question of how do we get these? How can we possibly determine them? And in a very small case, like if I'm like the Pisa ontology, for example, or small ontology, we could do this by hand, right? Just by engineering. Look, have an engineer look at the terms and say, roughly this is when people should be acquainted with it, or these are the criteria that we should expect. Or if something's very narrow in its scope, like FIBO, for example, everything in there is tailored to somebody that has, financial business expertise. And so it's, almost a no-brainer to determine what the criteria are for each concept in there. But if we're thinking about something large, heterogeneous in scale, the task is not going to be feasible to do that by hand, right? And again, this came up in psych. You've got millions, tens of millions of concepts. Who has the person hours to go and research these items to determine it? So finding a way to rapidly populate them is I think a reasonable question to ask. And what I want to suggest is that pointing to natural language corpora and finding ways to distill this information out of it, this is a way to rapidly get it. So again, pithy, almost truistic statement here. Thesis 2. Authors, people that write books, texts, typically use concepts only in case the intended audience is capable of comprehending them. If I'm writing books for 5-year-olds, I'm not going to typically populate those books with terminology from mathematics or pulmonary disorders, for example. I don't deploy concepts to audiences that I don't believe are capable of grasping those concepts. So, as a consequence, for something that's highly specialized, we should not expect to see a wide use of C in texts until it reaches that threshold for that specialized audience. We might see some occurrences, but we can consider these anomalies because we trust authors to do their jobs well. So we can partition classes of texts, and in the background, I'm thinking about Gutenberg. All the work I'm doing is against the entire project Gutenberg, but we can sort of partition texts on this basis. So we can think about elementary school level texts. We can think about things for middle schoolers. We can think about the text that a high schooler might be capable of reading, a biology textbook or Tacitus. And we can think of things like a graduate or postgraduate level, right? Like Hughes or Quine. And the upshot, right, is that we would, for something like dog, we would expect to see this immediately populated in children's books. But for something a little bit more complicated, right? So for something that we'd find in a biology textbook, like mitochondria, we would not see a great population in children's books, nor in middle school books, but we would expect to see a jump in terms of the density of concepts in that text. So looking for those jumps after we've evaluated text is something that is capable of, it's salient, it has information. So natural language corpora then carry useful information if we can partition them in an appropriate way. The challenge is just to extract and find a way to rapidly translate this information to something that's usable. And the way that I think that really works is going about with readability metrics. So readability metrics are something used frequently in pedagogy, right, to determine by analysis of a text if it's appropriate for a grade level. They're almost monolithic in their use. So their utility is, I think, without question. And one of the most important ones is this Flesch-Kincaid grade level. And it's a way of analyzing a text, and it outputs a grade level. So this is an appropriate text in a 5th grade classroom. This is an appropriate text in a postgraduate classroom. And the third thesis is just, again, experience bears this out, is that readability metrics are in fact a good proxy. Okay, so I'm gonna describe a general technique in about a minute to how to actually mine this stuff out. So first, for a concept, we have lexifications, we have like RDFS label. Use that and any auxiliary annotations we can to determine a syn set using WordNet, synonymous terms, and use a lemmatizer to get all of the different parts of speech that we can get out of that. For each text in Gutenberg, assign one of these Flesch-Kincaid metrics and partition all of Gutenberg by sort of scholastic level. And then determine the least partition at which instances of that set routinely appear. And then for things that are highly specialized, we can use metadata tags from Gutenberg in order to, this is something that's good for medical students. This is something that's good for physicists. The important thing right here is determining at which instances of that gamma C routinely appear. And that's the muddy one. But a coarse, but surprisingly effective way is to look for jumps in this sense. So that sort of algorithm right here is to take for each partition, figure out the ratio of elements of that set of synonyms to the total word count, and then calculate the increase in this ratio from partition to partition. And the greatest increase, the greatest jump right, is a pretty reliable marker of increased utility for that concept across those texts. So I'll just give you a couple instances of, I'm running a little bit over, of how this bears out, and the function seems to actually get things right. So if we look at something like dog, for example, and its synonyms, we find that it's immediately populated, right, at the sort of elementary school level. So this yellow is that inflection point. The biggest jump is from 0 to its grade school utility. Something like principle, right, which is abstract, we find at a sort of middle school level, that's when its greatest jump is. Something a little bit more baroque and abstract, like confederacy, that's political in nature, we find that this is around high school. And then if I take a Kantian term like noumenon, right, the jump is huge at the postgraduate level. That's where the big leap is. So we find that this, again, kind of course method gets the results sort of right. Our intuitive, like what age group or what class of people would understand this, it kind of comes out in the wash. So challenges, I'll just mention, right, of course, worrying about homographs and false positives, something that needs to be weeded out. Why I'm using sin sets to get this is to sort of eliminate the influence of false positives. People have brought up idioms as being also something that's interesting, but there's some work in WordNet on how to support and deal with idioms, and refining these functions for determining when something routinely appears. Like refining those functions is another step that I think it needs to be worked on. But that's, hopefully that's a method of, trying to rapidly generate these sort of, complexities en masse. And thank you very much for bearing with me as I went through all that. I appreciate your attention.